In this next segment, I want to talk about the systems perspective. So we've talked now about the family as a system, what we mean by a system, but the systems perspective has certain characteristics to it that cause us to look at the family not just in terms of the system's qualities, but with a certain set of understandings or methodological approaches. And so we call this the systems perspective. At the most fundamental level, the systems perspective or the systems theory approach is one that we call holistic. We are very interested in not thinking about looking at one member of the family's behavior towards another. We're more interested in thinking about everybody's interactions with each other simultaneously. So when we say a holistic understanding of the family, the best way to summarize that is with the saying, the whole is greater than the sum of the parts. You ever hear that? Mm-hmm. And you played softball, so you probably know that this is the case. A softball team is more than its members. Although maybe softball is more of the sum of the parts because it's how well you pitch and how well each individual member hits, right? But there's a team element that can enhance the run production that, for example, not everybody has to get a hit. Someone gets on first base, someone could sacrifice them over with a bunt. And so that's not showing that you're hitting, but you're contributing to the development of a run. Bicycling is one of the best. I'm a big fan of the Tour de France, right? And so what happens in the Tour de France? Well, it's teams. That's what's important. Teams. Why are teams important? Because you might have a really excellent cyclist, but that cyclist isn't going to win the Tour de France unless he has a good team. Because the team serves to be his windshield most of the way. The team is the one that helps pick him up and lends him a bike when his bike gets a flat or something to that effect. And so he can perform and produce a better outcome because he has a group behind him. And he can go faster because he's drafting behind somebody else. These kinds of things enhance the outcome beyond what it would have been based upon each individual contributing by themselves in, say, a time trial where each one runs by themselves and then they total their score. That's different than if it's worked together as a team. And families are like that. The whole is greater than the sum of the parts. Now, another way of putting it in the context of family, instead of using a bicycle metaphor or softball metaphor, is you can think of a family that, say, consists of two people who are really aggressive kinds of individuals. What kind of family life would those two individuals have? Do you think it would be a really aggressive kind of interaction that happens in those families? Well, maybe not. Maybe in order for that family to actually work, given that they're two aggressive people, they have to actually have in place a whole set of rules and procedures that help limit their expression of the aggression within the family. And so in that sense, just because two people are aggressive doesn't mean they're going to have an aggressive family. This is kind of important because people would think about schizophrenia or some kind of mental illness or alcoholism. It's an alcoholic family or it's a schizophrenic family. What does that mean? It has a member who has that characteristic, therefore the family has it. But not necessarily, right? It might be, the family might do things to, it'll create a structure that helps contain that problem. So if you're interested in adult illness or disability, that would be kind of part of that process. So individuals create relationships that then direct and constrain their behaviors in the group. So you just don't act the way you would normally act in the family. You are a person, you have proclivities, you have desires and pressures and dispositions to act particular ways, as does everybody else in the family. But you don't do it all the time that way. you constrain your behaviors, because in order for you to actually have a relationship, you have to back off, you have to accommodate, and other people have to accommodate you. So you put into place a set of procedures, a set of rules that help each individual member achieve their goals and the group achieve its combined goals. And it might not have anything to do with one individual or just adding up the characteristics of all the individuals in the family. Families are systems of interdependency between individuals and between relationships created by individuals as well. So it's not just can't add up the individuals and say, well, that's what the family is. I'm just going to ask this person what the family is, and I'm going to ask that person what the family is, I'm going to ask that person what the family is, and I'm going to take the average. We're going to add it up. I'm going to say, okay, well, how satisfied are you with the family? And how satisfied are you with the family? And how satisfied are with you in the family? And that will give me the average satisfaction score. No, it's more than that. Actually, it's the fact that this family has differences amongst its members in how they feel satisfied, whereas that family doesn't have differences. And so that's something beyond their satisfaction that's telling you about the family. You're actually able to characterize that family on something that relates to the relationships between the individuals, in this case, whether they agree or disagree on how satisfied they are. And that's kind of an important principle, because when we do research, many times on families, we actually take the average. And so we'd say, well, okay, how happy is this family? And that's usually the variable we're interested in. And we either take one member's report on how satisfied they are with the family and say, okay, this is a satisfying family because this member says it is. Or we take the average and we say, well, some people are more or less satisfied, this is the average, this is what this family is about. But perhaps what's more important isn't those individual assessments, it's what we know about the differences in them. And so when we start talking about the differences in the individual's perceptions or the individual's characteristics as being a variable of interest, then we're more at a holistic level. We're considering that the family is more than just the individuals. It's about the relationships between the individuals that get created in their day-to-day lives. And that's what we're interested in from a systems perspective. Not only is there relationships between the individuals, but there's also relationships between relationships. So what's happening between the husband and wife can only be understood if we know what's happening between each of those members of that dyad with the children. Or what's happening between the children if there's more than one child is impacting what's happening between the husband and the wife. And so we can't think of individuals or even relationships as being in a vacuum, that they are in the context of a larger whole. And that understanding was something that the systems perspective gives us that other perspectives don't. And we'll see how that's important when I talk about the reading that was assigned for today. Second, rejects the cause-effect logic of the scientific method. The idea of isolating causes by eliminating all external competing explanations is only part of the story. Causal variables don't operate in a vacuum. Oftentimes we want to know what makes this person happy, and we try to predict it with high levels, let's say, doing more of the housework. If you do more of the housework, you'll be less happy. Division of labor predicts satisfaction with the relationship. That's a causal connection. That's a cause-effect kind of reasoning, right? Well, in fact, maybe that is true to some degree, but maybe that satisfaction is based more than just on the division of labor in the household. Maybe the division of labor in the household has a lot to do with differences in values and beliefs or goals that the two members have for the family life, and that you can't understand one without understanding the other. And so you need to go beyond just what is the cause effect. We'll talk about this in a minute when I talk about the chapter for the reading, which was about Joey's problem. Joey has a problem, he won't go to bed at night. Why won't Joey go to bed at night? Well, we're going to see. Well, he won't go to bed at night because every time his mom puts him to bed, she plays with him. And she goes downstairs, and you think Joey's going to go to sleep? No, if he comes back downstairs, Mom will come up with him and bring him a glass of milk. Will Joey go to sleep now? No. He'll come downstairs because he knows if he comes downstairs, Mom's going to come up and do something else with him, read him a story. So he can do this all night long. Why is Joey not going to bed? Well, the cause-effect relationship is he's not going to bed because his mother's reinforcing his behavior, right? That's the reason. So just get her to stop. Just tell her, stop reinforcing his behavior. Can't be done so easily. Why is she doing this in the first place? Well, as we're going to see, it has a lot to do with her relationship with her husband and the division of labor in the family and who's doing most of that work and how much time each is getting from Joey and how much reward each is getting from Joey versus how much cost one is investment one is making. She sees herself as not getting as much from Joey as her husband is, and she's doing more of the housework and he getting more leisure time. And so in some ways, her going up and dealing with Joey is her way of trying to find some rewards from that relationship because she's got an inequitable relationship with her husband. So you can't just tell her to stop doing it. If you tell her to stop doing it, you're going to disrupt her relationship with her husband. They have peace at the moment. They're not going to have peace anymore if she doesn't get her time with Joey. And so there's a whole complex system of relationships that you have to take into consideration all at once. And that's why this perspective is so different in its approach to providing services or therapy to families that are having troubles, as opposed to a more psychologically oriented approach, which would focus on the ways in which different behaviors are being reinforced by different members of the family. This approach says, no, you can't isolate. You have to think of the whole. That you can't just treat an individual and make the family work. You can't even treat two individuals. You're going to have to treat the whole system together. Having people come in to get counseling for their families as individuals is a disaster. It doesn't work. You have to bring the whole family in. You have to sit down and interact with each other. You have to try to find the patterns and the interdependencies between the relationships. And so that's a holistic approach. It rejects this cause-effect logic. There isn't one cause. There isn't one effect. You're going to see in a minute. There's multiple causes of everything, and there's multiple effects of every behavior. And so you have to take it all together, and that's very difficult to do methodologically. All of what we know in science is how to isolate the cause and the effect and rule everything else out. Try to find that it's a pure causally valid relationship. But that denies the reality of life in a family. It's not isolated. You have to think about it as in its whole. And then effecting change in behaviors in families requires what we call understanding. Sometimes causal variables cannot be changed without disrupting other aspects of the family system. In order to treat a family, you have to understand it. You have to go in, you have to talk to them, you have to work with them for an extended period of time to understand what's going on in their lives, what's happened in their past, what they see as their future, how they're working as a family in many different ways to see how different parts of the system are impacting the problem that you're trying to address. And you never can be certain as it won't be necessarily one thing. It's probably going to be a complex thing that you're going to have to adjust. Make some changes here, see what happens, make some changes there. It's almost like chiropractic, I guess, we'll try to adjust this and then we'll see now that's off balance, so we got to get it back on balance, right? And most of the models that we're going to talk about reflect this because many of them are about balance. How do you keep a balance? And that's what's going to be important. Because when families get out of balance, they are pretty dynamic things and they can really then go really off the rails as a result. Okay, so tied to this is this idea of multiple levels of understanding, and the first level is what we call the associational level, and this is the immediate cause and effect. And I'm going to use Joey's problem in this textbook. And so to just sort of recap what happens, this is a family, I think they're called the Holts, and Arlie Hochschild went and she sat in on these families. She went to their houses. She basically kind of moved in. And she went home every night, but then she'd come back in the morning, spend all day, spend the evenings with them when they were there, and just sort of watch what happened and listened and took copious notes. And it's a really great, this book, The Second Shift, that she wrote. She'd studied 100 and some odd families, all of where the two couples were both working. Because she wanted to see how do families deal with this division of labor when they both have jobs, full-time jobs. And The Second Shift, the title of the book, comes from this idea of the husband and wife go to work, and then they come home, and then the wife goes to work again. She does the second shift. She does this extra half-time job, 20 hours a week, more than her husband, at taking care of the house and the kids and things of that nature. And so she went to all these different families, and one of the families she went to were the Holts. And she titled the chapter Joey's Problem, because in this family they have a myth that Joey has a problem. Joey's problem is he won't go to bed at night. The couple have defined it as Joey's problem. They don't have a problem. Their family doesn't have a problem. Joey has a problem. He won't go to bed. Right? So there's the culture, right? Here's a family that come up with this, the very idea of what is the problem with their family is Joey won't go to bed. It's causing all kinds of problems for them. They're not having sex anymore because the mother's going up and downstairs all night long getting Joey to bed. By the time she's done, she's exhausted. She's not interested. She's too busy. Because of Joey, he won't go to bed. If he'd only go to bed, they'd have some downtime. They could watch TV, have a drink, foster that romantic spirit. They would have a happier family life. But they can't because Joey won't go to bed. That's how they defined it as a family. That's the culture coming in, right? Joey's problem. Well, come to find out, it might not be Joey's problem. And that's why it's a great chapter title, because that's what she's intending for us to see. Joey's problem, not Joey's problem. Family problem. Okay? And in the process of describing what's happening, she's giving us some good examples of what, from a systems perspective, we can call 3 levels of understanding. And so the first level is the associational level. Why won't Joey go to bed? Is it that Joey is just a persistent, ornery kid? Or is something causing Joey's behavior? At a very basic level, she has observed this family and she's come up with the hypothesis, which is probably accurate, that Joey won't go to bed because Joey's mom is constantly reinforcing his not going to bed. What kid would go to bed if every time he gets up and comes downstairs he gets a reward? That's basic reinforcement psych 101 stuff, right? You give someone a reward, they're going to do it again. Right? And so that's the cause of Joey's problem. The immediate cause. Right? The direct cause is Joey's mom is reinforcing his behavior. But she goes beyond that. She says, yeah, but this is more than just her going up and reinforcing Joey's behavior. We get to go to a second level. The second level, although she doesn't label it this, is the meta-process level. This refers to the interdependent processes that are linked to the immediate causes. So there's something going on in the relationship between Joey and his mom, this is this reinforcement process, that's tied to the relationship that's going on between Joey's mom and Joey's dad. And to some degree, Joey's dad and Joey. And so in order to understand the process that's created this Joey's problem, we have to know more than that she's going up and reinforcing it. We have to understand that her going up and reinforcing it is keeping peace in other areas. Because she's doing the second shift, and there's such inequity in her relationship with her husband. He's getting way more out relative to what he's putting in. and she's putting way more in relative to what she's getting out, her rewarding Joey and spending time with Joey is her way of balancing the inequity that she would otherwise have with her husband. She has to get the rewards somewhere. So she's getting them from Joey, and that's justifying all the work that she's doing extra. And in fact, she's doing other things to keep Joey's dad from having a good relationship with Joey, and thereby creating conflict between Joey and his dad, because she won't let him have time alone with Joey, because every moment he has alone with Joey means that kicks it more out of balance. So she's maintaining balance in her marriage by reinforcing Joey, by spending time with him at bedtime. That's the only time she has. She has no other time. She comes home, she has to cook, she has to clean, she has to get Joey ready for bed. Day's gone. While she's cooking and cleaning, Joey's playing with his dad. And so she's not getting anything. So this is her way of balancing. And so to really understand what's going on, yeah, she probably knows she's reinforcing Joey's behavior, but it's not so easy to change, is it? Because that relationship is contained within a set of other relationships. Joey's hitting his dad, but that's not a problem that can be easily resolved, because that's not something that's being resisted by Joey's mom. So to fix Joey's problem, you have to fix Joey's mom and dad and the whole family system together. It takes more than just understanding the direct cause. You need to know how that relationship is tied to other relationships in the family, rather than how one individual is related to another, is causing the other individual's behavior. It's more, here's a relationship between Joey and his mom that's tied to the relationship between Joey's mom and dad, and also, by the way, Joey's dad and Joey. Joey's problem is kind of a problem of coalition processes, in the sense she's forming a coalition with Joey that's denying Joey's dad the rewards that would have created imbalance in her relationship, or more imbalance than already is there in her relationship with Joey's dad. So we call that the meta-process level. It's not a direct cause and effect. You have to look at all these things simultaneously and say, okay, this is what's going on over here, and if we change something over here, we might be able to stop this from happening if we resolve the inequity that exists between Joey's mom and dad by changing the division of labor. Then that might result in Joey's mom not doing the reinforcement bit, right? And so relationships are related to other relationships. And then the third level is the contextual level, and this refers to the organizational, cultural, environmental context that sustains the meta-processes and the direct cause-effect relationships. So in this case, the division of labor that exists in this family, who does what around the house, the power structure and the meaning systems that constrain meaning system constraints that set in motion the coalition process. So what does all that mean? Okay, well, so relationship here, Joey's mom and dad to Joey and mom over here, that relationship dynamic is really created by the constraints of how they've worked out to do the division of labor in their home, who's doing what jobs, and how much work is involved in each of those jobs. Some of that is tied to who has power. Joey's dad actually has a more powerful kind of job, and generally in families, men have jobs which have greater importance because they have greater potential for earning into the future, because of the workplace is structured based on gender and privileges men. And then finally, the meaning systems that are in this family. As I told you earlier, the idea that the family, in this case, has this myth that the upstairs is equal to the downstairs. So as long as they have the myth that the upstairs is equal to the downstairs, there's no understanding of why Joey has the problem, because the problem lies in the fact that the upstairs isn't equal to the downstairs in reality. And so that situation, taken as a whole, is what's creating Joey's problem. Another aspect of the cultural environment here is some statements that Joey's mom makes and dad makes about why men and women do things differently, why they do things or better or less prepared to do certain kinds of tasks. And that makes it very difficult for Joey's mom to get Joey's dad to do more. She's tried many, many times, but over time has evolved this idea that he can't do it, right? He can make a hamburger, but he just always forgets that it's his time to make dinner. He would do it otherwise, but he just always forgets because he wasn't properly socialized to care about those things. And so it makes her look like a nag because he can't help it. And as long as they believe that he can't help it, they're never going to fix it, right? It's still going to be a problem. And so those kind of meaning systems and the myth of the upstairs, downstairs being equal make it very difficult for them to solve Joey's problem, because Joey's problem lies in that inequality between the husband and the wife. That inequity here is creating that relationship between Joey and his mom and Joey and his dad over here. And they can't fix it because they have a certain set of meaning systems and myths about what men and women can do in families and what's equal and what's not equal that aren't true. And so they never can bring to the forefront the problem being that it's inequitable. And so they go on living their life, and they then make sense of it in a new myth that Joey has a problem instead of we have a problem. And so you can't fix this family without fixing the whole, right? Without fixing the individual relationships and without fixing the meaning systems that they've developed. They have to develop a new meaning system that is going to make it all possible. And so that's sort of why I love this chapter. You really need to read it, and I think you'll find it quite fascinating. And you can give me your reactions next time if you see something else in it. Finally, with regard to the systems approach, the last thing I want to talk about, this idea of equifinality of cause. And I've kind of hinted at it. Equifinality means any cause can have multiple outcomes, and any outcome can have multiple causes. Okay, so Joey's mom reinforcement behaviors not only sustain Joey's behavior, but also to serve to create equity in her marriage. So equifinality of cause. First principle, any cause of a behavior isn't just causing that behavior, but if you're in a system, it's probably causing something else. Going up, playing with Joey, reinforces Joey's problem, but also gives the wife more rewards in the family than she otherwise would have in a situation in which her husband is really making out better otherwise. And so the one behavior causes Joey's problem, but also is causing her not to have too many problems with her husband, right? They can have peace, right? They're not going to have any sex or any other kind of rewarding, because she's not going to go that route. She's not going to give him anything more, because he's already getting more, and she's just barely sustaining it through Joey. But they can have peace. They can live forward. They can still accomplish goals. Not going to be the best family life. Not going to be the happiest, but there's not going to be a lot of fighting. They're going to be able to have a peace. Okay? Any outcome can have multiple causes. Joey's problem isn't just being sustained by Joey's mother's behavior. In many ways, it's a product of the whole system's dynamic. So Joey's bedtime behaviors are not just sustained by his mom's reinforcement, but also the product of the conflict between his parents. So Joey's coming up and down, he's getting all these rewards, but it's not just that. Probably Joey senses the relationship between his mom and dad. In many ways, he's probably balancing that out by giving his mom these opportunities, which, by the way, he's also getting something from, right? And by the way, he can hit his dad. It's also part of the system. And so the outcome of Joey's, I'm sorry, the outcome of Joey not going to bed at night, that outcome, isn't just being sustained by Joey's mom reinforcing him. If she didn't reinforce him, what would happen? She'd spend time downstairs with her husband, probably fighting over the imbalance in the division of labor, the inequity in their relationship, which would probably keep Joey up anyway. So the family has found a way to create a balance. It's just not a very good solution, but it is a balance. And that's what family life is about. It's a balancing act. And that's the holistic perspective. I don't know if I hope that gets across to you. You maybe think about it, and if you have some questions, come back with them. But that creating a balance is what it's all about. And many times that's what families do. They create a balance, and many times the balance is just like not the best balance you could have, right? That there's better ways to tweak the system that can kind of create a system that's a balance that's more rewarding for everybody, and where you don't have to take some problem and say, well, that's Joey's problem, it's not our problem. We have a good relationship. It's just we've got a child. He'll grow out of it probably at some point, and everything will be fine again. But it won't be fine again. Yeah, he'll grow out of it, but they'll still have the problem. It'll just reveal itself in other places. The cause will have multiple outcomes, right? And so that's this idea of equifinality of cause. And then understanding family phenomena requires an understanding of the whole. Individual's behavior is seen as symptomatic of system functioning. So I think this is the last point on the slide. The systems theorist, when he looks at a family that has a problem, he doesn't focus on the problem as something to fix. Systems theorist says, oh no, the problem is probably a symptom of something that's the underlying problem. It's like taking antihistamines to stop your nose from running because you've got a cold. Well, there's a germ in your body that's causing the symptom. Yeah, you can deal with the symptom, but unless you deal with the germ, you're not going to get rid of it, right? It would be much better to get rid of the true cause. And so that's sort of the way a family systems approach, a systems approach to the family takes. It says, when I see a problem, I think it's not the individual, and it's not one person causing that problem to happen. It's probably that is a symptom of something that's going on in the larger system. And the goal then is to figure out what that is and how to fix it. Systems theorists, a lot of the early systems theory, when it first got applied in the study of families, it was at Palo Alto, at the institute there associated with Stanford University. And the people at Palo Alto were focusing on things like schizophrenia or autism in children. We know a lot more now about those things in their physiological sources and the roles of genetics in the brain and producing these kinds of things today than we did then. But it's not to say that what they were finding was not entirely wrong. That they were starting to say, well, maybe we can't treat individuals with mental illness outside of their families and then send them back and expect them to be fixed. That we can be, the history of the study of mental illness shows that, sanitariums and things where people in mental hospitals, people got sent and they got intensive therapies and they got cured, but then they put them back in their families and they went back into what they were before. Why? Because they had a place in the family. The family just sort of fit them back in and just reinforced that behavior again. And so those patterns are real, and those individuals then, at least their symptomology is continued as a result. So we generally see problem behaviors in families as being symptomatic, and then try to look for where's the imbalances that happen there. Okay? In this segment, I want to look at the readings that you had for the reading response and discuss the idea of what makes a family normal or functional as opposed to being abnormal or dysfunctional. We use those terms all the time. We go, oh, that's a normal family, or boy, that's a really way out there kind of family, or that family's really functional. I come from a dysfunctional family, right? And we throw those terms around a lot. And I think we often do it without thinking about what it is that we're saying. And using those terms can actually be kind of dangerous and misleading. And so let's talk a little bit about what we mean by normality or functionality in families. And that's what Walsh kind of looks at. And she looks at 4 kinds of ways that we might think of the family as being normal or functional. What would be some of those ways?
The family, oh, sorry, I have all these written.
Okay.
Okay, so the family, normal as in asymptomatic.
Okay, asymptomatic. So let's start there. What does that mean, asymptomatic?
So that there aren't any current problems within the family, within the patterns of like what the family's going through.
Okay.
Does that?
All right.
Yeah.
Good.
Kinda.
So the family is asymptomatic, an absence of pathology among members. The idea here is that if a member is displaying some sort of abnormal behavior, that's an indication that the family is abnormal, right?
Okay.
That there's something wrong with the family.
Okay, so even if one member is displaying it,
then that's a sign that there's something
symptomatic.
that it's not normal.
Okay.
That a family, if it's a functional family, all the members should be operating according to parameters.
Okay.
Right? And so that's the idea of asymptomatic. A family is normal, a normal family or a functional family is one that doesn't have any members who display symptoms of abnormality. Right?
Great.
This is basically a deficit view that fails to identify optimal functioning. That's one of the points she makes. So what do I mean here? It's a deficit view.
So as far as like optimal functioning, the way I take it is that not every family is going to function the same way, but as long as their patterns are functioning to their best abilities, then does that?
Kind of. That's one of the criticisms that she makes of it, yes. But beyond that, I mean, another aspect of it is that we're saying a family is normal as long as it doesn't have any symptoms. Does that mean that every family that doesn't have
symptoms is not normal?
Every family that doesn't have symptoms is normal.
Okay.
Or is functional. Does that make sense to you?
Yeah. So every family that doesn't have a problem is normal.
Right.
Right.
Or functional.
Or functional. Okay. I see that, but I mean, I don't necessarily.
You see a problem with that?
Yeah, because I feel like, what Walsh says is like there is essentially no family that is problem free. Right? Okay. That's one of the comments, or one of the.
There's no family that's problem free, which means there'd be no normal families.
Yeah.
If we're saying asymptomatic.
Right.
But even beyond that, in the sense that this is a deficit view, it's saying that if you look at a family and you don't see any problem behaviors, that means that family is really working.
Okay.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, it makes sense. I'm sorry, I was just looking at it in a different way. So I was like, oh, okay. Yeah, so I see that, I guess. I don't know.
All right, well, one thing wrong with that is that there's a lot of families that don't have any obvious symptomology. There's a lot of families in which we don't see someone with mental illness or someone with a alcohol or drug problem. There's a lot of families in which we're not seeing any symptoms.
So I'm like outside looking in. So this is just like the face, what we see. Okay, that makes more sense.
But some of those families maybe are better than others. Right? So there's a lot of families without problem behaviors in them, individuals with problem behaviors. But that doesn't mean that all those families are functioning at the same level.
Right.
Some of those families might be more optimal than others. And when I say more optimal, I'm saying they might enhance the outcomes for their members better.
Okay.
They might be able to achieve their goals better. They might be able to adapt to their environments better than some of the others who also don't have any symptoms in them. And if we're looking for what's a normal or what's a functional family, don't we want to find out what are the family structures and processes that result in a family optimizing its outcomes as opposed to one that just avoids problems.
Okay.
And so Walsh makes this criticism of this approach, this asymptomatic definition of what makes a family normal or functional. She says, no, we can't use that because there's a lot of families that don't have symptoms. And it's reasonable to expect that some are better than others. And this approach doesn't give us any insights into what determines which ones are better.
Okay.
Because it's a deficit view. It just, they all lack symptoms, so they're all equally normal or equally functional. And Walsh wants to go beyond that. She says, no, but they're not all optimizing outcomes. They're not all equally capable of adapting to difficult environments when they happen.
Right.
And so to classify them as being equally functional is misleading. In the future, they might run into problems. And what we want to do is know what makes an optimal family so that we can help families today that aren't having problems, help them prevent having problems in the future. And if we do that, if we can identify those characteristics of what makes a truly functional family, we use a standard of what optimizes outcomes instead of what avoids problems, then we can advance our understandings of families better and help families in the normal range be better.
Okay.
Is that?
Yeah, that makes sense.
Okay.
That's
good.
I was wandering down the wrong path.
That's okay. No, you weren't entirely, because some of the things you said reflect some of her other criticisms of this approach.
Yeah, I was thinking as far as like cultural norms and like religious views and like even what environment a family's placed in like plays
Plays a role
in like the problems they have, how the family develops, and like because of that, like not every family can be like optimizing their, you know what I mean? Optimizing their like.
And that, so we could also say there are also circumstances
Yeah.
which makes for optimal
So,
functioning.
Not every
and-
family can be equally
Right.
optimizing. Okay.
And we'll actually come back to that because that is going to reflect a second or a third, one of the other criteria that she talks about, the idea of the ideal, and we'll come back to that. Okay, so let's say on asymptomatic for a moment. Not only does this approach fail to identify optimal functioning and distinguish between the broad range of families which don't have symptoms from the less optimal to the most optimal, but it also ignores the resiliency of a system to individuals' problems. Okay? Identification of problems and seeking help may actually be the sign of a functional family.
Okay, so that relates to the family being healthy if they can confront.
A family we think is healthier if it, instead of suppressing the symptoms of the person with the problem in order to appear normal, it actually might be a more functional family if it doesn't suppress the symptoms, if it recognizes and realizes that it has a member with difficulties and tries to help and seek help. And a family is not going to seek help for that member unless it recognizes it and the symptomology comes out.
Okay.
And so when we see symptoms of a member of the family, it doesn't mean that the family is dysfunctional. It actually might mean that the family is actually doing something good. A functional family is one that wouldn't ignore the symptoms or wouldn't suppress them. A functional family is one that would recognize them because you can't treat them, you can't deal with them unless you recognize them. And so that's a second criticism of this approach, of thinking of the normality or functionality as a lack of symptoms. It would be like saying a lack of conflict is a sign that a family is a good family. You think that's true?
No, I think conflict is what brings people closer together. I feel that if there isn't conflict, then I think that things are just going to fall apart, I guess, essentially.
Good.
I don't know.
And yes, and there's a lot of evidence to support that idea. If there's a lack of conflict, that means that you're saying that you're actually trying to say that amongst a group of people, there's nothing that they ever come into conflict with. No, they have conflicts of interest all the time. and they get in each other's way all the time. And if they suppress that, then what happens is they just continue to get in each other's way, and they don't recognize it, and they don't fix it. They don't do anything to resolve it or to manage it. All they're doing is hiding it. And that can cause all the members to become dissatisfied. They're not going to like the system anymore. It's not meeting their needs, because their needs are never being expressed, because they come into conflict with someone else's needs, and so we can't have conflict. And so conflict would be a kind of a symptom, not of an individual, of the relationships. And that doesn't mean it's a bad family. In fact, the lack of conflict would be an indication that in all likelihood there's something wrong with that family, right?
It's just a matter of time.
It's just a matter of time. Or they're just going to drift apart because they're never engaging. And so this is a second criticism of this approach. The lack of problematic behaviors is not a sign that the system is bad. I mean, it's good. It's actually maybe even a sign that there might be something wrong with the system, because those kinds of things have to get expressed in order to be dealt with. A third is the assumption that the family is the cause of the individual problems. So if we say that someone has an alcohol problem, so there's something wrong with this family, you're kind of blaming the family for that person's alcohol problem. The alcohol problem might be genetic, biological, could from stresses outside the family. So this assumption is wrong. A family could have a member who has a problem and it not be the cause of the problem. And this deficit view, or this asymptomatic view, is basically making that the opposite assumption, that the family is going to be, whenever there's a symptom, it's because there's something wrong with the family. Now, remember when we talked about the system's perspective, I said the perspective often takes the approach of when it sees a problem in a member, it says, well, that's a symptom or potential symptom of something going on in the family. Yeah, the approach is that way, but the approach doesn't in itself say that the family is responsible for the problem. It just says that this is a clue that there might be a problem. And so, and that we shouldn't ignore the family dynamic aspects of the problem. We shouldn't jump to the conclusion that it's an individual. That's the source of the problem is in the individual. We should look to see whether or not there's a possibility that the problem could come from the family dynamic. And that's a little different than this, right? Because this is saying, no, if there's a problem, it's because of the family.
Okay, so is this kind of how like families get labeled with like whatnot? So like, oh, that family is like into alcohol or drugs.
Yeah, that's
because,
an alcoholic family.
Yeah, because of one person. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Now, to some degree, the family dynamic might play a role in that person's alcoholism. That's true. Mm-hmm. But in and of itself, the alcoholism doesn't say that the family is the source of the problem.
Right.
Right? The second approach to normality is that it's a normal or functional family is what's typical or average.
Okay, this is the one I like really struggled with.
Okay. So what's typical? What's average?
That's what I'm like, how I don't understand how researchers or whoever define what is the norm, like what the average family is, you know what I mean? Like,
yeah.
I don't understand that. I understand that varying too far from the average family, whether it is above, like average being optimal or below, is abnormal, but I don't understand how the decision of what is typical
Is created.
Yeah.
It would be through research.
Okay.
So the researcher would look at the data, national data, and you could examine, okay, well, typically in families in a given society, what's the amount of affection giving between members?
So then does that vary for each region? Like,
well, this would say this is not addressing that issue. I mean, you might be able to say within each region.
Okay.
Although I think ideally we would want to know what were the characteristics that transcend boundaries, right?
Because I know like there's different like, you know, levels. Like there's different extremes, and I didn't know how they would like come together to like even out, I guess. Okay, so that is sort of a side part of this.
we can talk about the typical average. I think initially let's talk about it as
Okay, sorry, yeah, I was just,
within a given society, and then saying, okay, what people are, if we say that people who share a common society share a common set of challenges
okay,
that they need to adapt to,
okay, that makes more sense to me.
and participate in a common set of institutions, and that doesn't vary too much across regions, although you might make a distinction between urban and rural.
That, yeah, I was kind of,
Okay, that's about as far as you might go here. And you'd say, well, then the kind of pattern that we're seeing in the family amongst the majority of the families living in that under those same environmental conditions should be the thing that is the most optimal. Part of this comes from a functionalist perspective in sociology. So, and remember we talked earlier about institutional definitions and how they come about, the social constructions. And I said, well, it depends on what the environmental conditions are. Some
Yeah.
types of families are going to be, the families are always going to adjust themselves to fit within their environments. If they don't survive.
right,
And so the assumption here is that most families in a given society are going to adjust themselves to the conditions of survival that society experiences in ways that work. There'll be some that don't. And so, but most of them will, otherwise the whole system would fall apart. And so what we're going to do is do a study, and we're going to study all the families, and we're going to classify, we're going to sort of measure different aspects of the system dynamics and take the average as what's normal.
okay,
So I could look at how much affection do members give to each other. Who makes this decision, the husband or the wife? Okay. Is there a strict division of labor with respect to getting things done in the families based upon age and gender or whatever? Okay. How much conflict is there in the family? How is conflict expressed in the family? We could do a whole set of sort of measures of family interaction patterns and dynamics, and then take the average. Okay. So a normal family is one that has this much affection given. A normal family is one in which the husband-father makes most of the decisions, because what we observed in this society is husbands and fathers make most of the decisions, right?
right,
A normal family is one that has small levels of conflict. A normal family is one in which there is strict discipline, in which children are punished with spanking, because most of them do it.
okay,
Okay? And that's the idea here, typical or average.
okay.
And so now what's wrong with this idea? I think you kind of expressed it a little bit when you said, well,
Oh,
where's the cutoff point?
oh, as far as like, even if a family's functioning optimally, like they're not typical or average because they're either like they're too far above,
Right,
or if a family's too far below the average, they're not functioning normally.
right.
but-
Where are the cutoff points? And
Yeah.
do we treat the ones who are very different on one end as dysfunctional as the ones that are very different on the other end? So
Even-
if a family gives lots of affection, way beyond the average, is it as dysfunctional or
As-
abnormal as the one that gives no affection? Because they're both deviating from what most families do, and that's the middle part, the middle amount of affection. So that's one problem. Where do we set the limits? And do we judge deviation from the mean, from the average, in both directions? Do we judge that in the same way? That these are abnormal families? Well, in some ways they're abnormal in the statistical sense, yes.
Yeah,
But in any other sense, maybe not. Right?
right.
So, what is the cutoff point for normality or abnormality? And she makes that point. And what about positive deviations? How do we treat that? And that's so she's identifying is that's a problem with using the typical or the average as our indicator of what's optimal or what's normal or what's functional. Another problem is normality could result from shared dysfunction. What happens if in a society, on average, husbands hit their wives?
Yeah, that's not okay, but if it's the average, then
This
isn't
would
her.
say it's
okay.
normal.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Or
would
I
say-
mean, it's normal.
Yeah, or functional. What happens if women never get any say at all in decision making?
Then, according to this, it'd still be normal.
But not necessarily,
Yeah.
because we could think of, well, is that optimizing? We could take a different approach. We say, well, it's okay if it's normal if you're only interested in what maximizes the husband's outcomes.
Yeah.
But when you look at the woman, what is she getting from it? And how,
Nothing.
you know, so it's kind of hard to make that judgment that this is normal or this is functional. Or what happens at hostile parenting. Spare the rod, spare the child, right? Spare the rod, spoil the child. You ever hear that saying?
No.
No?
No.
See? We're making progress. I mean, 100 years ago, spare the rod, spoil the child would have been the dictate of parenting. That if you do not punish and use hostile parenting techniques, your child will become spoiled. Basically ruined. So you should use physical punishment of children. Today, we don't see that as being a valid principle because we know more about what maximizes the outcomes for children. And so this parenting technique, while it may have been normal in the past, according to what's typical or average, doesn't mean it was necessarily something that optimizes the outcomes for the family. Remember, whenever we say optimizing outcomes for the family, we're talking about something that optimizes both the group outcomes and the individuals within the group, because the group is we're seeing as one of the functions of the family, one of the goals of the family is to maximize the outcomes for individuals. And so this problem, second problem with using typical average is this idea of normality could result from shared dysfunctions. Could be that every family in that society is dysfunctional, right?
Right.
Or we could have a whole society of dysfunctional families. A third criticism is it fails to recognize subgroup culture and context. And you mentioned this as well. So what about families in the South versus families in the North? What about African American families versus Hispanic families? We hold them to the same standard of normality as the dominant family, which would be the white family, the Anglo family.
Okay.
And there's a danger there, because family forms are non-normally distributed. There is an average African American family, and there's an average Hispanic family, and there's an average Anglo family, there's an average Catholic family, there's an average Protestant family. And to some degree, the differences in the ways in which those groups organize family life, to some degree, it's shared because they have a shared environment that they're dealing with, but across groups it's shared. But in other ways, it's not shared across groups, but it's shared within groups. That African American and Hispanic families might look different because they have something else they have to adapt to that Anglo families don't have. Persistent societal discrimination and prejudice.
Yeah.
And so they might have to organize their families slightly differently and their family practices differently in order to accommodate the unique position that they hold in the broader society that makes them different than the dominant group. And so by using what's average, what's typical, in our society today, most families give their children more independence in adolescence, right? Mm-hmm. So all families should be doing this, and if they're not, then there's something wrong with them. And so if we look at African American families, we find that in fact, they don't give as much independence to their kids in adolescence as Anglo families do. Up until about 16, they kind of hold them back. Well, why? Because the environment they live in is affected by discrimination and prejudice. And so their kids, if they get into trouble outside of the home, are more likely to get arrested. Whereas a white family's kids, if they get stopped by the police, they're more likely to be just brought home. And so they're going to get treated differently. And so the family is actually more functional if it restricts its children outside the home in the African American community. In the Hispanic community, they give their children lots of freedom outside the home, but when they get to be older after 16, girls are given total freedom because they need to go out and find another family to start. Boys, on the other hand, they are highly restricted and brought back into the home because they're needed to take over responsibilities in the home. And that's the system that they've worked out historically that's always worked for them, and it's still continuing today. There's nothing to say that it won't continue to work for them that way. And so we can't judge every subgroup by what the dominant group is doing, because they might have special circumstances, both in terms of current ecological context might be different. I mean, there's a lot of it shared, but some of it might be different. And they also have different historical patterns that may have evolved over time that work perfectly well in today's society alongside whites doing different things. But it's not wrong, it still works. It's just a tradition that they're holding up. And so this perspective doesn't allow for that kind of idea that you have the potential for these differences amongst subgroups. It tends to give priority to the dominant group's patterns. Third perspective is the ideal. What's best? What does society say is best in a family?
So, well, from this, I took for society, what is like the normal ideals would be best for a family. But what I got from this is that what is ideal and healthy is how the family's patterns function in how they work for them effectively. Does that make sense? So
Okay.
a family functions ideally when their patterns are optimal.
Okay, but here is, how do we know what is optimal?
Okay. Wow.
Who sets the standard? We've said we can't use, well, it's optimal as if it doesn't produce symptoms.
Right.
We can't use it's optimal because it's the typical or the average. So now, what do we use for what makes it optimal? Well, we use something called ideals. Not in an abstract sense, but in an actual concrete sense. What are the ideals of a society?
Okay, so this is still within each so say area that you live in. So say I live in Wenatchee, and our ideals are you go to church every Sunday and everyone volunteers. That's what.
That's for individual behaviors in society.
Okay.
But then we could even go into the family. We could say, well, our ideals is every night the family should get together and eat together. Or the ideal is that every child should have a level of privacy.
Okay.
What are the ideals of what establishes a family? That children listen to their parents.
Okay.
Could you think of what those ideals would be if you think of Wenatchee?
Okay.
How would you classify Wenatchee?
As far as what my family ideals are?
What Wenatchee's ideas, the people who live in Wenatchee, what are their ideals? What would they say, this is a great family? These kinds of characteristics make a great family.
So, discipline children in aspects to respect to.
Okay, disciplining children in aspects of
Respect to elders. And then I would say education is,
Education, so providing opportunities for children to succeed in the educational world.
And then I would say activity-based.
Okay, having lots of activities.
Yeah, so.
Shared activities, right? With parents and siblings all together usually, right?
And then I would say also community-based. A lot of families are involved within the community, so I would say that
joint involvement in community activities, church, volunteerism. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah. So that's how I would, and then those would play a role in the family. Does that? So those play a role within the family. Is that how I'm relating it?
Yeah.
Or how? Okay.
No, you're good. You gave me some.
Okay, I was like.
These are the ideals of the people of Wenatchee.
Okay, yeah, for the most part. As I see it.
That these are what the people of Wenatchee say make a good family. Yeah. It has to do with where they focus their activities as a family, how they interact with each other sharing a lot of joint activities together, be it either volunteering or going to church or going to recreational activities as a group, right?
So,
Observing holidays of family members, special events. And one of the other that you said was, the very first one was disciplining children to show respect for authority, right? And obedience, I imagine.
I just like, maybe I see it that, I don't know if this makes sense, but I see it that way because I grew up in a like white upper middle class
Right.
family. So I know we talked about that and I know that plays a role on it, but
Yeah.
that's how I see it.
Yeah, yeah.
Okay.
And that kind of ties into what's wrong with this approach.
Okay.
Whose ideals should we use? Now, should we use the Wenatchee white ideal? Or should we use the African American Seattle lights,
'Cause they're
Seattle community's ideals? There might be some things shared, but there might be some things different. Should we use the Bellingham liberal family ideal, which is, I don't care about obedience. All I care about is innovation and exploration and thinking about the reasons for your actions rather than punishing you for just doing something wrong. I don't care about following rules. I care about following principles. So there might be a different way in which these family ideals are established within groups in society. And so which one is the better one? Which one should we use to define normality? Should we use the Wenatchee model? Should we use the Mississippi model? Should we use the Bellingham model? There's no
right or wrong answer.
right or there's no way of knowing which is right and which is wrong, right?
Okay.
And so that's what's wrong here. We don't know which ideals are the best ideals. Be they cultural ideals, which is what we were just talking about, social constructions based partly on society's realization of necessities determined by socioeconomic context, but also based on power and worldviews. So, to some degree, what we hold as the ideal, what we hold as the standard, is developed over time within that society or community because that's what our forefathers and foremothers learned worked. And so we establish that as the ideal, and we profess it, and we advertise it, and we put it in books, and we put it in TV shows, and magazines, and all the other things that convey group ideals to the populace. And so people follow the Wenatchee ideal because
It's what has been done forever.
they see it every day on the radio, it's in the local radio, they see it in the local paper. These things are being held up as this is good. We even give awards sometimes for Father of the Year or Family of the Year, you know. And so what we're doing is we're advertising what we've learned in the past has worked. To some degree, it's a reflection of what you might say is functional family life. A kind of family life that fits the environment. And after all, that's one of the big factors in knowing what's functional. It's what works. And so you could say, well, yeah, these ideals are reflecting some reality that would reflect on the idea of what's functional or normal. However, that's saying only one kind of family life can fit. And that the one that developed over time is the best one that can fit. And that's where we get into trouble with using what's the ideal of the community as our criteria for what's functional or normal. Whether we're talking about the white community in Wenatchee, or we're talking about the African American community in Seattle, or we're talking the Hispanic community in Sacramento, we can't use even subgroup ideals, because even within subgroups, these patterns of life may have been ones that worked, but those patterns have also been influenced by systems of power and value systems that those groups have. And so philosophically we call it reify. We make more real something than it really is when we use the ideal. Because in fact, the ways in which these family types evolved not only reflects the need to adapt, which is a legitimate criteria for functionality, but also reflects the power structures that were existent in those societies. And so people are going to create over time a pattern of family life that works in terms of adapting to the environment, but also works to privilege certain members over others. And so we can't use the ideal as our judgment of functionality because of this power element in how social constructions come about. Does that make sense to you?
Yeah.
That's a tough one, I know.
Yeah. Sorry.
Right?
Yeah.
So you might say, well, the family of Wenatchee is probably a male-dominated family, a patriarchal family, right?
Yeah, pretty much.
The men makes the decisions, the males are responsible for the instrumental activities, etc., right? So that works, and it's probably always worked in Wenatchee society, right? This system of family organization probably was great for an economy based upon agriculture, right? Picking apples and cherries, right?
Everything, yeah.
Apples and cherries and
Pears,
corn and
yeah,
whatever,
whatever.
right? So whatever that, the environment dictated that families organize themselves in a particular way to maximize the return from the environment, to maximize adaptation. So to some degree, family life evolved to today, and you say, well, that's ideal, and it wasn't just made up. It came about because of the realities of everyday life as individuals tried to make adjustments to the patterns of life that were dictated by agriculture. But some aspects of the family organization had nothing to do with adapting. Some of them had to do with the fact that men had control over the things necessary for life. And as long as men had control over those things, they were then able to shape other aspects of family life to their benefit. So men were able to get control of families and be leaders of families because they owned the property. And that gave them power to shape roles in the family in particular ways and shape the dynamics of family interaction, maybe lots of hierarchy, in ways that allowed them to maintain their control. Had nothing to do with adapting successfully to agriculture. It had everything to do with them being able to maintain their control.
Okay.
And that is where we run into problems. Because if we use the ideal, we're going to privilege some members of society over others. Because society is not equal. Members of society aren't equal in power. And especially in the context of family, we're talking about two things where power is definitely unequal in society: gender and age. And so those families have evolved partly because they're adaptive and thereby functional, but partly because they're serving the interests of powerful individuals. And so we can't use the social construction because of that. Another problem, these ideals, these cultural ideals, are variable across societies and segments of a single society. So we're going to have lots of, if we use this standard, we'd have lots of different standards. And some elements of reality, but ignores alternatives that may be equally valid or functional given the same environmental conditions. So when I say, so the Wenatchee family type, I love this idea, the Wenatchee family type, right? So the Wenatchee family type, as we've constructed it here in class, based upon your experiences growing up in Wenatchee, the Wenatchee family type might be functional, but it doesn't mean it's the only possible functional type that could have evolved. There could have been other kinds of variations in family life that may have actually been equally functional or even maybe even more functional than the one that evolved. So just because this is the one that evolved doesn't make it the only or the best one. It just makes it one that works. And so that's a problem with this approach.
Okay, I was going to say there's different levels of, or different ways a family can be functional.
There are different, yes, there's something called functional equivalence,
Okay.
right?
Right.
That you could have two things that are different, but are equivalent in terms of their functionality.
Okay.
And that's a problem with using cultural ideals, that could be the case. So if we choose this one, we're privileging it over another one that might work just as well, or might even work better. Just because we're using the ideal doesn't mean it's the best one. Because again, there can be multiple patterns that could adapt to the same environment, so multiple ones that could be functional. And in all likelihood, the one that is the standard is probably one that's very much influenced by power, by who has power in that society. Okay?
Right. Okay.
What about using what sociologists say is the ideal? I mean, we study groups, right?
Right.
Shouldn't we know? Let's just ask Professor Bulcroft, or let's
Yeah.
let's ask Professor Teachman, or they study families. They should know. They can tell us what's ideal.
Okay.
What do you think? We're experts. So the idea of disciplinary ideals is based on the judgments of those who study societies and work with families. We'll ask the family therapists. We'll ask the family sociologists. We'll ask the family psychologists. We'll get them all in a big room. We'll have them with a whiteboard or one of those flip charts, and they can start writing down things that make families functional or normal.
They're all going to be different, though?
Well, but we'll take the ones that they share.
Okay. I mean, they wouldn't all be different, but there would, you might have a different perspective.
We'll take a vote.
Okay.
We'll take a vote. But we're the experts.
Right.
So we'll just let the experts make the decision. What they think is ideal is the thing that we'll accept. See a problem with that?
Yeah. First of all, you guys are in power, but that might not be what's working for, I don't want to say the average or typical because that didn't work. The family, the family dynamic or structure within
Yeah,
family.
nothing says that we have any criteria.
Yeah.
And we might, trying to get with what you're saying, say it again.
What you guys might think would work might not be actually what's working for families.
Right, so what we think works the best,
Because you have knowledge of how a family is supposed to work.
how a family is supposed to work, which comes from somewhere,
Yeah, sorry. Might not be how.
might not be the reality for a lot of families.
Yeah.
That we might be blinded to a group of families that can't operate under those parameters. We don't have definitive knowledge. This is the notion of science. Science never knows anything.
Right.
Well, science can never prove anything, right? All we can do is just keep on researching. We could be very wrong. We could be very, very wrong. Take in physics, right? Newton was wrong. Well, he was right to some degree, but at a very fundamental level, he was wrong. Einstein showed that he was wrong. You needed a whole different story about how the world worked, of how the universe worked. And then Einstein showed that he himself, then later showed that he was wrong. Right? Because we learn new things and we never exhaust the source of information. And social science is particularly prone to this because our studies, all our knowledge is coming from our working with families or our studying families with our methods. And there's no reason to believe, and every reason to not believe, that we have covered the whole society, that we've covered everybody under all circumstances. Our knowledge is limited, and at some point in time, we're going to learn something different. It's like saying, does a doctor know what's best for you?
You hope so.
Well, you hope so, right? But we've learned more and more over time that, it used to be you shouldn't drink wine. Oh, but wine's good for you now. You shouldn't eat chocolate, but now chocolate's good for you, right? Mm-hmm. You're supposed to take vitamins. That's the latest thing. My doctor told me in my last checkup. You need to take vitamins.
Thank you.
Yeah? Guess what?
Did you start taking vitamins?
I did, but you don't have to.
Oh.
And now seems to be new research that says that vitamins aren't all that important. Isn't that interesting?
Yeah, very.
Minerals are still important, but
Yeah.
you usually are going to get most of the vitamins you need if you eat right. So, the problem with the disciplinary ideals is it's limited by clinical experience and theoretical orientations. So people see the world from a certain perspective. A lot of our early studies of family life were based on a psychoanalytic approach. So we had this whole idea about sexual energy transferences and early lifehood experiences that then shape our family lives in the future, and how family life can foster something that we couldn't even see in the individual in terms of these psychic transfers, etc. You're not going to find many people in the psychoanalytical field anymore. Yeah, there's still a lot of them, but there's certainly grown a lot of other different perspectives of what makes families work for individuals, and psychoanalytic is only one of them. So each scientist will have their own perspective, and how do you bridge that? It's very difficult, because none of the perspectives are themselves reality. They're just ways of interpreting reality. They work to some degree, but they don't necessarily work fully, to the full degree, for all families. And so, and usually they're coming out of clinical experiences. So who did you interact with as you developed the idea of what's an ideal family? A good example of this is, what do we know about the effects of divorce on children? There was a researcher in San Francisco who wrote a book on the negative impacts of divorce on children, in which she really exaggerates the effects. Well, why? Well, what was her findings based on? Well, they were based on her clinical experience in a Jewish clinic for boys who were having difficulties. And so she had a lot of boys with difficulties. She wasn't studying the whole population. She was only looking at
A limited.
Jewish boys with difficulties. And so she happened to observe that a lot of them came from divorced homes, but she didn't do a systematic study of that. And she was only looking at certain groupings and how their families were organized, maybe not a larger group. So we're always, and that's an extreme case, but even when we do large national samples, we're still limited in our observations. We can get some ideas, but we're by no means experts on this. Second, susceptible to biases from the cultures of the professionals involved. So where do most family sociologists come from? Do you think they come from the lower social classes? Do you think they're African Americans and Hispanics? There's a few.
I was gonna say, are most of when you were talking about professors, I was like, but you guys are all like Caucasian.
We're all white.
You're all Caucasian.
All middle class.
Yeah, like I wanted to say it, but I was like.
Yeah, some of us are come from lower class origins, myself, for example. But most of us come from middle class origins.
But not complete poverty, and you're not of
Not complete poverty. Probably, there are some minorities amongst us, but the majority of us, if we're taking a vote, it's going to be white middle class men.
Yeah. I was gonna say,
and in the family field, more women. But so we're susceptible to the same biases as the general population, and we're going to make judgments which are in our interest. We're going to make judgments about what's an ideal family. Well, first of all, we're all going to think that we have an ideal family. Mm-hmm. So it's going to be what our family looks like, and everybody else should have like us, right?
Right.
And so that's you can't really even use disciplinary criteria, ideals. Finally, is family process perspective. In this case, we say what's normal or what's functional by what are the traits that increase adaptation to contexts and maximization of individual and joint goal attainment over time.
Okay.
So what we're going to use is we're going to say, well, what's normal and functional depends.
Right.
It depends upon what are the contexts that you need to adapt to, and what is going to maximize both the family joint goal attainment and the individuals in the family's attainments. So we're going to use that as our criteria.
Okay. I was gonna say, as far as so I know you mentioned earlier, a few days ago, about when a disaster happens,
Mm-hmm.
In a family, something
Mm-hmm.
terrible goes on. So how does that, I don't know how to ask this. So like, as far as like a family, the process they go through to adapt to that
Mm-hmm.
and achieve their goals, even though it's like the disaster's bad, does that make their family functional?
Yes, it could.
Okay.
I mean,
I
when
know
I say
that's off
here
track.
adapt, we can talk about adaptation at two levels.
Okay.
So we could say adapts to your everyday context.
Mm-hmm.
So you're an African American living in an urban center.
Yeah.
You have to live with that every day, or you live in poverty, whatever, right? Versus your middle class suburban family, okay? And so whatever that context is, what kinds of family arrangements allow you to successfully manage that context,
Okay.
and in the process of manage it in a way in which you get the most that you could possibly get out of it for the individuals who are part of the family and for the family unit itself to survive.
Okay, I see.
That's the first level. The second level is, what are the characteristics that not only make it possible for you to adapt to that standard context and maximize outcomes, but what are the things that your family possesses that allows you to change in the face of some catastrophic event?
Okay.
So there's two levels of adaptations: the normal everyday adaptation, and then there's the adaptation to stressor events
Okay.
when they happen. Okay, and I
Got
think the latter is what you were talking about.
Yeah,
with
I had it on
Okay.
one of my questions here, and I just.
Okay, good. So different system characters could be more or less normal and functional at different times in the life course, at different points in history, and under different environmental conditions. So what's a normal family look like? Well, it depends. Who's in it?
Great.
What is their stage in their life course? Does it have adolescence in it or no adolescence in it? Where are the parents in terms of their development and their careers and trajectories? Is it a family that's maximizing their outcomes as well as their children's outcomes? And those are the things that we're going to judge families on. Every family will look different than every other family and still be functional or still be optimizing. It's going to depend on what are their circumstances. The circumstances of their members, and so their life course position.
So that would be like age, gender.
Age and gender intersecting.
Yeah.
And so you're a certain age and a certain gender, you're going to have certain needs, you're going to have certain pressures. How does a family organize itself to help facilitate your ability to get through that point in your life and move forward and optimize your outcomes later on as a result?
Sorry, backtrack. Does this also include gay and lesbian couples as
Gay
well?
and lesbians as
and
well.
like interracial.
Sure.
Okay.
Yep, yeah.
Okay. Sorry. Just.
So the sexual orientations of the members, yes.
Okay.
And then at different points in history. So what's going to be optimal, what was optimal for families, for lots of families after 9/11 in 2001, when those planes hit that tower, lots of people experienced extreme anxiety around the country. And there was a lot of work, a lot of family sociologists actually had to come into the media and talk about, well, how do I tell my children about this? How do we manage this as a family? Because I'm also anxious about it. I feel uncertain. And so families have to deal with that because they're living together and they're going to have to, that uncertainty can affect their dynamic. And so families have to arrange themselves in a way that helps them adapt to those historical circumstances, or what's adaptable today in a modern industrial society that may not be optimal at all in an earlier agricultural society. What's adaptable in the different environmental conditions, what's adaptive in Wenatchee might be different than what's optimally adaptive in Seattle. To the extent that those two places have very different environmental conditions. No. The reality is today, Wenatchee and Seattle probably aren't that different.
No, a little bit, but
A
not.
little bit, but
Not terribly.
yeah. Maybe someplace in the middle of North Dakota and Seattle, yeah. Okay? Or the middle of Mississippi or Arkansas, yeah, probably. Okay? And so what we're going to do is we're going to, the whole thing that we started with, what makes a family normal or functional, is, the answer is none.
No, okay.
None of the above.
That's what I was confused about
Right?
the entire time.
Or all of the above, if you want to put it that way.
Okay.
All of these other ways of doing it have problems. The only one that works is the family process approach, which answers the question in a kind of ambiguous way. It kind of says, well, it depends.
It
That's
depends on
answer.
the family.
It depends. It depends on the who's in the family, what is their stage in life. It depends upon the historical period in which they live, the conditions of the life around them, and it depends on their environmental circumstances at that historical point in time.
History, where they live, who's in the family.
Right?
Right.
And so you have to take all three of those things into consideration, and then you answer the question, what's optimal or functional or normal, based upon an analysis of what kinds of characteristics best allow the family to adapt to those situations and the big criteria here, maximize the outcomes for the individuals of the family as well as the family's ability to survive into the future. And that can only be done through study. And so we have to learn principles. There isn't one kind of family that's optimal. There are a set of principles under which families might operate that will determine their functionality or their normality. But there isn't a one size fits all. And I think that's where Walsh leaves us.
Yeah. That's what I was trying to look at the entire time. I was like,
So
none
which
of
one
this,
is it?
I was like, none of this really makes sense to me, because I was like, this doesn't work, you know?
Yeah.
I was relating it to my own family. I was like, this isn't how, like,
Well, I think what she did was she wrote the chapter specifically to challenge this idea that we actually, in many ways, carry around with us, because in a society, we want to have an answer about what is the best.
yeah, because that's what I feel like that's what our society is now, is like, what family is the, not even just family, like, who can have the best, what is the best, you know,
Yeah.
how you should, what job you should have, how you should look, you know, what you should do.
But it's not just our society today, all societies.
Oh,
have
yeah,
that,
all
right?
societies, but
So,
I'm saying,
but we want an answer.
yeah, that's
right?
what we've.
We don't want the answer, it depends.
Yeah,
And that's what she's trying to say. You're not going to get an answer.
yeah, okay,
That if you really want to understand families and families as systems, you have to understand that no two are going to be alike. And they can all be optimal and still be different.
They can be equivalent, but they're not.
They're equivalent, but not they're equivalent, but not equal.
Okay.
They could be equivalent in terms of their optimality or whether or not they're functional, but they might look very different from each other. Okay?
Okay.
And so you have to do an analysis of the circumstances that the family is under and the way it's organized itself, and be able to make a connection between the two. And that's, remember I said the systems perspective is this sort of touchy-feely,
Yeah.
kind of, well, we gotta have to get in there, we gotta monkey around and see, well, what works best, and change a few things to tweak it to get the best, you know, it's like a mechanic with an engine, you know, I gotta hear that sound, it's gotta be that right sound, right? You'd be the Click and Clack brothers of family sociology. So it may be possible, the second part of this is it may be possible to identify traits that generalize across contexts. So it still might be possible, even if we accept the idea that the answer is it depends, there still may be some things as we try to answer the question in every circumstance, we might start to find that, geez, it doesn't matter what the circumstances are. It seems that a family that has a certain aspect of their communication patterns that looks like this seems to work in this situation, in that situation, this situation, seems to generalize across lots of situations.
So some aspects of family are generalizable to
They might
the
be.
population.
Yeah, but that's what we're in the process of trying to find. What are they?
Okay.
If they exist at all. So rather than start with these are the ones, we do the collection and we start saying, oh yeah, these seem to be generalizable characteristics. Some of the areas that we will talk about as we go through the course, communication effectiveness, and we have to think, well, that makes sense, because a family is a system, and any system, in order to operate, has to be able to communicate information from one member to the other. So there has to be something about there has to be something about communication that maximizes its effectiveness, that allows systems to adapt. Whether it's a family system or whether it's a computer guidance system, it still needs to be able to communicate in order to regulate itself. Togetherness, cohesion. Families can't exist unless there's something tying them together. They can't adapt, they can't maximize outcomes unless there's something tying them together. So there must be some level or nature of togetherness that families have that make them better.
So can cohesion, well, I guess, yeah, I think it still can, but can cohesion still exist between divorced families? Like, I remember reading that some, like, children function better when their, like, parents are separated. Maybe I didn't read that here, but.
Sometimes, yes.
So can cohesion still exist on, like, divorced or separated
Yes.
family levels? Okay.
Yes, to some degree.
Yeah, so
But-
there's different levels,
Yeah.
obviously, but. Okay.
Yeah. But there has to be some cohesion for the new divorced family to work.
Right, because,
If there's conflict between the parents after they're divorced, then the family's not going to work.
right,
There has to be things that allow them to work together and tie them together. Now, in the case of that circumstance, you also have to take in, now we're getting kind of complex
yeah, sorry.
because remember it's a condition where you have three families here. We have the two divorced families and we have the joint combined family, right? Flexibility, being able to change, because let's face it, families are places in which people grow and develop.
Right.
And so what was a structure that worked yesterday is not going to work tomorrow. So if you don't have flexibility, then you're not going to function as well. So that's a sort of a general principle that we might be able to come up with. Okay, clarity of roles, people know what they're supposed to do. It doesn't matter who does what, it's just that they know that this is my responsibility and they follow through on it. Boundary maintenance, being able to manage the interference from others, being able to monitor the environment, those would seem to be important regardless of where you lived or whether you were a Wenatchee family or a Seattle family. You're going to have something in place to maintain boundaries.
We talked about that, the open and closed boundaries, okay.
Mhm. And then cultural integrity, that a family needs to have a sense of who they are.
Okay.
They have to have a set of shared meanings. Without shared meanings, there can't be interaction. And so these might be some things that, and actually there are going to be some things when we get into the family systems models, that family systems theorists say, okay, I'm going to give you some ideas of what makes an optimal family that are generalizable across all situations. And they're going to look at some of these kinds of dimensions of family life.